So one of the ways you can think about vitamin D deficiency is you can divide it reasonably into severe deficiency or kind of a milder deficiency. As you would expect, the severe deficiency is a little more rare, a little less common, and mild deficiency would be more common. In fact, I read recently, not surprisingly, of course, but that about 90% of the world population has insufficient vitamin D intake or insufficient vitamin D status. Well, how could that be? And I've already answered that question back in 2004 in a major article that I wrote. And the answer to the question is pretty well known, and that is modern humans, for the most part, wear clothes. We're all clothed all the time, and we live indoors, and so we don't get the vitamin D exposure, or the sun exposure that would lead to vitamin D production. So food sources of vitamin D don't really exist in terms of providing enough vitamin D. Some foods are fortified, as you all know, but they're insufficiently fortified to provide what we need. So the human requirement is about 4,000 international units per day, and no food source provides that in a palatable form. You can get it. Stop. Pony's eating the wood. You can get vitamin D from a food source if you're willing to consume cod liver oil, but I think most people will find it to be pretty disgusting. So, real food sources to provide a physiologic dose of vitamin D really don't exist. So you should be getting it from sun exposure, but we modern civilized, so-called modern humans, we live indoors and we live in clothes. So none of us are getting, the 20 to 30 minutes per day of equatorial full body sun exposure in the middle of the day that would provide us the vitamin D that we need. So as a consequence, again, most people are vitamin D deficient as a consequence of deficiency is a qualitative state, so let's quantify it a little bit into severe or milder forms. And the severe form of vitamin D deficiency in its clinical presentation is called osteomalacia, and that presents with bone pain, muscle weakness, and depression, and usually pain. So bone pain from the osteomalacia itself, muscle pain from the hyperinnervation and the central sensitization and neuroinflammation, and muscle weakness and fatigue and depression. That's pretty classic. Severe might also include seizure. Severe vitamin D deficiency can produce seizure, and ironically, anti-seizure drugs can cause vitamin D deficiency. So that's a kind of a paradox that you want to be aware of in the vitamin D world. Mild vitamin D deficiency mostly presents with things like non-specific presentations like fatigue, depression, and apathy, and increased risk for cancer and infection. So what would be the advantage to denying the existence of vitamin D science, vitamin D deficiency, and just kind of sidelining or ignoring the whole topic, or addressing it in a way that makes the whole thing just look stupid? The advantage politically is that you've got a population, 90% of the population, that's going to have pain and fatigue and frequent infections and a whole host of immune-related health problems to occupy them. So they're going to be less likely to be politically engaged if you keep them occupied with health problems that could have otherwise been easily prevented or addressed and treated. So what portion of the population is most likely to be vitamin D deficient? People who are less educated and with less money, who have to use, for example, like public health services, in contrast to people who have more money and more education who get private healthcare and medical services, I would argue, with probably better doctors, or at least more motivated doctors, right? So I'm all for public health care. But the reality of what I have seen and experienced personally from public health care is that it's really low quality. And I'm not being, I mean, it's what I've seen in countries that provide free health care on a public basis. That what I've seen in terms of public medicine, so to speak, would be considered malpractice in the United States, for example. I mean, the quality of care is so bad, it's negligent, and it's a standard of negligence. So again, what's the advantage to keeping people weak and distracted and vitamin D deficient and all that? It keeps them sick and distracted, and prevents them from fully engaging socially because they're spending a lot of their time with apathy, depression, fatigue, bone pain, muscle pain. They go to doctors who are not trained in nutrition, and the doctors say, oh, well, you need this new COX-2 inhibitor. That's not the appropriate treatment for bone pain and central sensitization caused by vitamin D deficiency. So vitamin D deficiency creates a type of pain that is outside of the medical paradigm. So in the medical paradigm, we have different types of pain within the medical paradigm. Typically, most articles and books talk about 2 types of pain, or maybe 3. They talk about nociceptive pain, which is what is kind of like normal pain. You know, if you have an accident or bump into something and it hurts, that's nociceptive pain. It's pain from pain receptors behaving normally. The other type is neuropathic pain, caused by nerves that are diseased or damaged or injured, and they are sending pain signals inappropriately. That's called neuropathic pain. That's most of the medical paradigm around pain and all the drugs that go into either of those categories. Some articles also talk about visceral pain as a third category. I guess maybe more modern articles these days would talk about central sensitization, but that's most commonly an extension of a different type of pain. So nociceptive pain can become centrally sensitized and amplified, just like neuropathic pain can become centrally sensitized. A few articles, or book chapters in my case, which I've either read or written, and some articles that I've refuted publicly and had those refutations published. If you look at my article that was published in Nature Reviews Rheumatology in 2016, talked about neurogenic neuroinflammation as a source of central sensitization. I can agree with that model, and I can also disagree with it. I think it's completely accurate in some situations, especially complex regional pain syndrome. But I also think that model can be overhyped to sell more drugs. So again, the basic medical model of pain looks at nociceptive pain, neuropathic pain, and visceral pain. Sometimes they talk about central sensitization, but that's usually an amplification of a different type of pain. In my model, the one that I'm working on right now for my update of Chapter 3, I talk about either 11 or 12 different types of pain. One of those types of pain is what I call metabolic pain, or in this case, nutrient deficiency pain. And that's vitamin D again. So vitamin D deficiency is its own type of pain that doesn't fit in the medical paradigm of nociceptive, neuropathic, or visceral. She's trying to decide if she's going to behave well today or not. I don't know why that dark cloud is above me. So, anyway, if you want to keep a population weak, debilitated, sick, depressed, then make sure that they're vitamin D deficient. And be sure to avoid talking about vitamin D as a legitimate intervention for the prevention or treatment of that impaired status or state. So the marginalization of vitamin D as a topic selectively impairs certain parts of the population, especially people who don't have money to get out of the kind of vicious cycle of poverty and illness, don't have education to either coincide with the money that it would then take to access the information. You know, the other day, for example, I saw, well, I think it was just yesterday, somebody put a comment on a discussion that I started saying, well, everybody has access to information. If you think everybody has access to information, you're out of touch with kind of the global society. So first of all, not everyone has a computer, and not everyone has a smartphone, and not everyone has an iPad or a tablet. Stop it. Not everybody has that stuff. So if you think everybody has that stuff, it's because you live in a world where you take those things for granted, but not everybody can, and not everybody does. Beyond that, beyond the simple fact of people not having access to those things, not everybody has high-speed internet. And the people who do have, let's say that someone's on the poorer and less educated end of the socioeconomic spectrum, just because they get access to, you know, a computer or something, and they have internet access, doesn't mean they're going to go look up health information and interpret it and decide how to apply that to their lives. They may be trying to find a job. For example, like let's say a person doesn't have a computer and doesn't have internet access, and they go to a public library, assuming they have access to a public library. That's another assumption, by the way. But let's assume that they go to a public library that has internet access. Do you think that they're going to sift through biomedical research to determine the relevance and applicability of vitamin D research to their particular case? Of course not. They're going to look for jobs. They're going to maybe try to catch up on the news. They're going to be in contact with friends and family. So let's say that they go to a public library, they have internet access, and they've got 30 minutes to use it because it's going to be limited if it's public. In a lot of situations. I mean, it would be nonsensical to think that they're going to have the interest or sophistication or ability to go dive into biomedical research and make sense of it. I mean, that's just stupid. So that was a comment made on one of my posts the other day. Somebody said, well, everybody has access to information, and everybody can decide what they eat, and everybody can empower themselves with a healthy diet. Are you kidding? That's stupid. While I'm on that train of thought of privileged stupidity, one of the dumbest things I've ever heard anybody say is that, like, something to this effect, that the biggest determinant in your health is what at the end of your fork, or some stupid thing like that. Those are the kinds of privileged, class-specific comments that get like a standing ovation in the functional medicine world. If you go say something like that to a bunch of newbie medical doctors who have never studied nutrition, I mean, they'll clap and they'll applaud and they'll say, yes, we have the answer to disease. It's diet and it's personal choice. a lot of people don't have those personal choices. They don't have the educational background to interpret the data. They don't have the sophistication to even think in those terms of deficiency, subclinical deficiency, mild deficiency, severe deficiency, subperiosteal edema leading to or resulting from osteomalacia, then leading to chronic pain. And people don't think in those terms. Doctors don't think in those terms. So to think that the general public is going to liberate itself by having access to the internet is pure stupidity and privilege. So again, by keeping vitamin D kind of out of the limelight of social awareness, we're selectively disempowering people who don't have access, don't have money, don't have education, and don't have kind of the sophistication to go to that level of thought, which would then enable them to kind of treat themselves and engage in preventive medicine when the rest of the world is kind of ignoring that. So again, by keeping vitamin D in the dark, that's kind of a pun, by keeping vitamin D in the dark and keeping people in the dark about vitamin D, we select against people who don't have money, education, access, or people who are just older and aren't going to initiate a research project on their own behalf. They're just going to assume that their doctor is educated and knows about these things. But the doctors aren't educated and knowledgeable about these things for the most part. So for example, like in my own case, I went to a top-ranked medical school in the United States. Obviously, I graduated. And I graduated with honors. I was in the top 10% of my class. I took 4 different medical licensing exams and scored in the top 1% or the top 5% of every one of those exams. I did a predoctoral research fellowship through the NIH on integrative medicine. And I did all of that and never had a single conversation about vitamin D unless I was the one who initiated the conversation. But my point is, even the best students from the best medical schools, in this case from the United States, they don't know anything about vitamin D deficiency other than rickets. So I realize I'm rambling just a little bit. But, you know, these are all things to think about in the politics of vitamin D. Why is it ignored? Because it suits the interests of the ruling powers to keep it ignored. The most important political strategy in any situation is to keep people dumb, weak, sick, occupied, uninterested, distracted, unengaged, and uninformed, but not simply uninformed. If general education is of such a low quality that people don't achieve a certain level of kind of intellectual sophistication, then they don't even have the intellectual hardware to ask the right questions. So think about that. I think that I said that correctly. So again, the most important political strategy is just to keep people out of your hair and distracted and doing other stuff. But the other upside of that, or the positive aspect of that from a equation standpoint, is that if they are impaired and sick and more likely to get infections and more likely to get diseases and more likely to have pain, then they need drugs. Well, in the medical model, they need drugs. So it becomes a vicious cycle of not only keeping those people occupied and disengaged politically, but they become a source of income because they're sick and needy. Depression, infections, even vulnerability to infections that would otherwise be benign or mild. Now these become multi-billion-dollar profit centers. So, again, the people most affected by that are poor, uneducated, black, so-called black. I hate using that term, but that's how it's used. So I gotta go.